Okay. So last week, I think we started to do a section which was prior to the previous Mishnah, which we then also got onto. But it was discussing really the ending of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva ceremony in the Beis HaMikdash. After all the celebrations and each day, when the Kohanim and Levim used to leave again, finished one day, and then they'd make their way back again down to the Shiloh pool to fill up with some more water for the next day's libations. So they made a statement as they turned towards the Mizbech, and they said, Einenu lokah, anu lokah ve'einenu lokah. We are for Hashem, and our eyes are directed towards Hashem. Which the Gemara explained as being a statement of loyalty to the Mizbeach, to the Beis HaMikdash, to contrast with the disloyalty, the Avodah Zorah of the first Beis HaMikdash generation towards the end of the first Beis HaMikdash, when the Beis HaMikdash was still in use, but nevertheless was also a forum for Avodah Zorah at the same time. It was a place of very mixed loyalty to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So as a result of that, in the second Beis HaMikdash, there was a ceremony at the end of each day of a Simchas Beis HaShoeva, in which the celebrants affirmed their loyalty to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and only to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Gemara asked the question, how can you double up a statement? If you remember, we did this last week as well. Anu lokah ve'einenu lokah. We have similar statements in the Gemara elsewhere. Someone who says Shema twice or Modim twice, such a person is pulled off the bima. He's not allowed to carry on because it does look as though he's giving showing allegiance to more than one deity. He's keeping his options open. Maybe he's turning to the left to Baal and to the right to Hashem. And so he says Modim and Modim. He says Shema, Shema. And at the time, of course, it was not so unusual to have allegiance to more than one deity. So Chazal were very concerned that anyone who displayed that sort of tefillah, where he doubles up on a sentence, needs to be put in his place, and because it looks terribly much as though he is supporting of two deities. So how can the people leaving the service of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva repeat Anu lokah ve'einenu lokah? It essentially looks as though they're saying we're for God number one, and our eyes also return to God number two. So the Gemara explained that there was a reason why this statement doesn't fall under the same suspicion network, if you like, as saying Shema twice or saying Modim twice in close succession. So that was allowed. And that was the end of the Gemara prior to the previous Mishnah. And then the next Mishnah we did was all about the shofar blasts. I won't go into that again in detail. It was all about numbers. The Mishnah actually said that on any day, it wasn't the shofar so much. I think let me change that a little bit to the trumpets. There were shofaros that accompanied the trumpets, but it was the chatzotzeros. And in the Beis HaMikdash, there was a lot of trumpet music. And the Mishnah said that on any day, the minimum number of blasts that would have been blown, I'm just going to mute people because I forgot to do the muting. The minimum number of blasts was 23. There were at least 23 occasions when the trumpets would be blown in relation to when they offered the Korban Tamid, when they started the service in the morning and in the evening. And the Mishnah enumerated all those 23 occasions when on a normal day the trumpets would be blown. The maximum that was blown was on a Sukkot at the days when there was a Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And then there were a lot of extra trumpet blasts during the Simchas Beis HaShoeva celebrations and all the rituals involved there. And it went up to a total of 48. And the Mishnah gave us this whole gradation of what days there were 23 and when it was 24 and when it was 30. And it was the days of Sukkot reached the peak. And this is our Masechta. That's why that particular Mishnah was in this Masechta, Masechta Sukkah, because it reached the maximum of 48 occasions in which the shofar was blown together with the trumpets. And really the trumpets were the main instruments because we don't actually find that the shofars were blown on during the normal routine within the psukim in the Torah, but the Torah doesn't mention chatzotzros. So the shofars were really just an additional accompaniment. So that was the last Mishnah that we learned. And then we started learning about the Gemara. What did they blow? They blew tekiah, trua tekiah, which we're very, very familiar with on a Rosh Hashanah. But they were actually blown on a daily basis by the trumpets themselves. The same sort of notes, a long note, and then a broken note, and then another long note. That would constitute a 3 notes out of the 48, the way in which the numbering went, the Gemara explained. So that was around towards the top of Nun Daled Amud Aleph. And I'm going to do something very naughty now. I'm going to do a bit of skipping because there's an awful lot of technicalities that go on about note blowing, which will get us very deeply embedded into arguments here and there that don't actually change the topic and don't actually come up with any real conclusions. So I'm going to take us forward instead, if you've got your Gemaras, to Nun Hey Amud Base, or the sheet that I attached to my invitation, 45b, and it's right at the top, Yom Tov Rishon HaChag, Shal HaChag. And this interesting, this next Mishnah is also all about numbers. We have 2 Mishnayos, one following the other, both full of numerology. And the numerology is relevant, but the Mishnayos even read in a very similar way. This time, we're not going to be discussing the number of shofar blasts or trumpet blasts. We're going to be discussing how the Korbanot HaChag were offered up, the various sacrifices. And we know that on Sukkot, there were more Korbanot offered than on any other days of the year, more than on Pesach, more than on Shavuot. Sukkot was unique because the Torah gives us instructions about the Porot HaChag, and the number changes. There's a complicated configuration of Korbanot depending upon which day of Sukkot it is. And there's a variation between, not only in the total number, but also in the makeup between Porot, oxen, and some of the others, the goats and the sheep. And I'll have a look at that, and I will show you some charts because it's very difficult to see this without actually seeing it somehow on a table on paper. So I'll take you through it. This Mishnah teaches us not so much about the number of korbanot, which the Torah already instructs us in, but it tells us how the various offerings of the korbanot were apportioned between the Kohanim. And as we look at it, we get into a very fascinating subject, which is how were the Kohanim and their routines configured during the year, and particularly on Sukkot, when we have so many korbanot. Who decided who would get what? How were they grouped? Where did they live? Where did they come from? What were their responsibilities? That will take us into quite a deep dive into the history of the Kohanic groups by family name as well. I'm only going to start the Mishnah just to give you a flavor of the Mishnah. I'll read the Mishnah for the first few lines. It'll be completely incomprehensible because the Mishnah is incomprehensible without dredging into its details, but you can't get into the details without knowing some of the background. So just to give you the rhythm of the Mishnah so you can see what the Mishnah is all about. This is the top of Nun Hey Amud Base, 55b. So the Mishnah says, B'yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag, on the first day of Chag. Chag always means Sukkot, festival, but only Sukkot is referred to simply as Chag, even without Chag HaSukkot. On the first day of the Chag, Hoyusham Shlosha Osa Parim, there were 13 oxen or cows, Parim, Elim Shnayim, V'sor Echad, Elim Shnayim, 2 rams, V'sor Echad, and 1 goat. Nishtayu Shom, that means they were left over in terms of sacrifices to be offered, Arba Osa Kvosim, 14 sheep, Lishmona HaMishmoros, for the 8 Mishmoros. We'll see what a Mishmor is in a moment. But Yom HaRishon, carrying on in the Mishnah, on the first day, Shisha, 6 of the Mishmoros, Makrivin Shnaim Shnaim, offered 2 of these sheep each. Vasha'ah, and the remaining mishmaros, echad echad, offered one each. Basheni, on the second day, chamisha makrivim shnaim shnaim. 5 of the mishmaros offered 2 each. V'hasha'ah echad echad, and the other mishmaros 1 each of the sheep. Bashlishi, on the third day, arba makrivim shnaim shnaim. 4 of the mishmaros offered 2 each. V'hasha'ah, and the other mishmaros echad echad, offered 1 sheep each. Boravi, on the 4th day of Sukkot, Shlosha, 3 of the mishmaros, makrivim shnaim shnaim, offered 2 each. V'hasha'ah, and the rest, echad echad. And so it goes on. So the Mishnah has got a rhythm, and it has a progression as well. We'll try and understand that progression. But before we do, a little bit of a background, because the Mishnah here is more interested here in the mishmaros and how the mishmaros carried out their duty than how many sacrifices there were. You need to do a bit of arithmetic to add up who was offering what to get to the number of korbanos. But it's because the mishmaros, the various mishmars, the watches of Kohanim had to be apportioned the jobs. And the Mishnah has instructed us how that apportionment took place. So what's a mishmar, first of all? So mishmar is usually translated as a watch, and not the one you wear on your wrist. I'm just sharing. I didn't share screen. Let me just go back again. I did entirely the wrong thing. Back again. Share screen. Okay, so the mishmaros, the watches, very much we're talking here about a rota. There's a rota of families of Kohanim. Each rota was called a mishmar. That was also further broken down, but let's start at the highest level of a mishmar. You have lots and lots of Kohanim living in Eretz Yisrael. They're all originally descended from, if you like, from Aaron. Down from Aaron, we have Elazar and Itamar, who were his surviving sons. And the Kohanim all descended from Elazar and Itamar. And this goes on all the way through the First Temple period, and even down through the Second Temple period, in terms, at least as far as the Kohanim who returned from Bovel to Eretz Yisrael is concerned, because not all the Kohanim returned from Bovel after the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. Many found life so comfortable in Bovel they remained behind. But let's go back to the time of the first Beis Hamikdash, where you see the Mishmar system being implemented. That Mishnah system was implemented and is described in Divrei Hayomim. So it's biblical. It is here in Divrei Hayomim. I'm sharing my screen here on Divrei Hayomim. And let's just read a few verses. And it's really quite a mouthful, but it'll give us an insight to how the Kohanim's roles were divided by family. So the Posuk says, if you're reading it here with me, just doing the top line now here, we'll just do this briefly. I won't go through in any great detail because there's a lot of name dropping to come, which will bore everyone. And the names are all rather difficult as well. So the psukim say here in Divrei Yomim, Vayachalkum b'geralos, and he divided them up using a lottery. There were already lotteries in force at the time to decide who would get what. Eila imela, these with those. Ki hoyu sorei kodesh v'sorei holehim mibnei Elazar ubivnei Isamar. And this would divide up. Sorry, I have a shul function to do. 1 second. A job. I have to let someone out of the shul car park. That's one of my functions. It's not an easy one. If you'll just hold on while I. Oh, goodness me. There's someone stuck in the car park and needs my assistance, which I do through a mobile phone. Carry on speaking amongst you. I've let him in. Okay. So the Posuk says that the descendants of Elazar and Isamar had to be divided up, and they were done. This was done by a gorol, essentially by a lottery. Vayichtavim Shemaiah ben Nesanel haSofa min haLevi. He was the Levi and the scribe, and he wrote down the results of the lottery. Lifnei HaMelech, before the king, v'hasarim, and before the princes, v'tzodok HaKohen, and before Tzodok the high priest, v'Achimelech ben Aviosa was also a Kohen, v'Roshei HaOvos LaKohanim, and all the other major groups of Kohanim, v'Lalvim base of Echad, Achuz le'Elazar, this is all quite difficult language. There were groups and holdings amongst of the Kohanim to the family of Elazar, and others the family of Itamar. Now, of course, we're talking about many hundreds of years after Elazar and Itamar died. So we have, if you like, the lineage of the Kohuna being retained for several hundred years. And then a lottery being made so that the Kohanim could have a fixed rota, and it wouldn't just be Hefka when Kohanim came in to do their work. There were more Kohanim than were needed to do the work in the Beis HaMikdash on a daily basis. So they needed to be organized. And the main organization takes place here during the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, although there must have been some earlier organization, even at the time of Moshe and subsequent times. So it says, Vayetzar Gorol HaRishon Lihoyoriv. The results, who came first in the lottery? You know, who won top prize? Why does it make a difference who gets where in the lottery? We'll see in a moment. It ranks them according to which week they serve, and perhaps in terms of some other functions as well. Everybody wants to have the first bite of the cherry. So who comes out first? Yehoyariv, the family of Yehoyariv. And then LeYodaya Hasheni, to the family of Yodaya, was second. LeChoram Hashlishi, third was Choram. LeSa'irim Haravi, to the family of Sa'irim, the fourth, Malkiyah HaChamishi, to the family of Malkiyah the fifth, and so on. And it goes on. This is all from Divrei HaYomim. I'm not quoting anything from the Mishnah of Gemara. And it goes on up to the 24th of these family names, Lema'aziyahu Arba Vesrim. The family Ma'aziyahu had the 24th position. They came bottom, if you like. They pulled the short straw. Not that it makes any difference. It's just a question of where you appear in terms of the order in which you will be doing service. But nevertheless, everybody wants to be first. It's like having the first aliyah. You've got to organize this thing so there's going to be a machlokus. And finally, the Pasuk says here, this is the way they were appointed to their service. Lavo Beis Hashem, in order to come into the Beis HaMikdash, Kamish Batam, according to their rights, Biyad Aharon Avihem Kashet Tzivahu Hashem Elokei Yisrael. That this was a lottery, if you like, process that was commanded by Kodesh Baruch Hu towards the early parts of the first temple. So what do we see from here? We see already biblically there was a rota system, which we call the mishmoros, the watches. Those consisted of large family groupings. Now, how was that used? So each mishmar, each of those 24 names, family groupings, were given the privilege of serving as Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash for 1 week at a time. So the first group number 1, would do 1 week. And when they left, group number 2 would take over for the second week. When they left at the end of the week, group number 3 came in. And the swap over took place on Shabbos, as the Gemara explains in various places. That was when the if you like, the relay changed hands. It was on a Shabbat. And they would do this twice a year because you only have 24 weeks with 24 rotas. Twice a year means that they'd come in again at the end after their 6-month break. And there would be a total of 48 weeks in which each of these mishmaros reigned supreme for that week. And then the other 4 weeks, we will be talking about Chagim, when all of them used to come in together. And all the watchers were privileged to serve on every Chag. And that is, they were not, there was some sort of way of choosing who would do what, but they all came in at the same time to serve for a Chag. Each mishmar, in turn, was divided into 7 botei av, 7 smaller family units. And that's how the days of the week would be divided up. So you'd have 1 mishmar, of which 1 beis av would serve on the Shabbos, another one on the Sunday, another one on the Monday, and therefore all the 7 Botei Av, smaller family units, would serve for a particular mishmar in a particular week. And that was the organization, really, of the temple service. However, what is very interesting is the history of this and how the loyalty to these groups continued. Let me take you further and show you something very interesting. Let me read something from you and to you and translate it. This passage, interestingly enough, but I haven't shared with you because I pressed the wrong button again. Chotosi Ode Palm. So I'm going to try and share screen with you again. So this passage over here is not taken from an encyclopedia, but from a tourist site. This is a site that it tries to get people onto a tiyul. And if you go onto this tiyul, particularly interesting for you if you're a Kohen, it will take you through the various towns in the Galil that these various Kohanic mishmarim or mishmaros ended up in. And therefore you can say, oh yes, this is where family Yedayah was, etc. I'm not sure who's interested in a tiyul like this, but nevertheless, it gave us this interesting piece of background information, which I'll go through. It says, Lamrot Chorban Beis HaMikdash, despite the destruction of Beis HaMikdash, Notzra Tofar Chevrotit, an interesting phenomenon appeared, Yehudit Shel Orei Kohanim Begalil, that after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the families of Kohanim actually moved into the countryside, into the Galil. They couldn't live in Yehuda anymore. And the Kohanim stuck together. They stuck together in essentially family moshavim, large family moshavim, possibly each mishmar consisting of hundreds of Kohanim living in a single commune or population. And Professor Shmuel Klein, Mechashuvi HaChokrim Sheretz Yisrael, Bereshis HaMea had 20 Chidesh Rishima. One of the researchers did a lot of research on this through manuscripts, through documents, and through scrolls to determine where all these Kohanic Mishmarim moved to. And he used a number of sources for it, including many documents from the Cairo Geniza, which actually mentions where these Kohanic towns were in the Galil. And a little bit later, this remarkable stone plaque was found, which actually gives us the names and locations of all the 24 Mishmaros Kohanim, and it comes from Caesarea. This was uncovered in Caesarea, and it's probably like 1800 years old. And if you read it, you have 24 lines here. And look, Mishmeres Rishona, the first Mishmar, Yehoyariv, that was what we found in Divrei Hayomim. That was his name. He was the first Mishmar family head. And it says Mirsaravi Miron. That's where he came from. I'm not sure what Mirsarve actually means. It's not a translation of someone who refuses. It's a place. Mishmeres Shnia, the second one, was Yodaya. And he came from Amok Tziporim, which could mean Tzipori. Let's go back again just to prove it for you. And here you have Yehoyariv and Yedayah. Here we don't have any places. And presumably these Kohanim may also have lived outside Jerusalem and come down for their week in Jerusalem and then gone back up again for 6 months, come down for another week in Jerusalem. They had time off. It was like the Miluim now in the army, and they would come back and they would serve their week. And so it goes on, except here we're giving all these different names. And here's Mishmeret Esrim V'Arba. This is the 24th group, the 24th Mishmar. And it says here, may something Ariach. I can't even read it properly, but it's all here. It tells you where the Kohanic families moved to. And from this, if we progress further, this takes down the same information, but you see it in a tabular form. So here, for example, the first family is Yehoyariv, and it said, as you saw in this Caesarea relic, from Misarve Moron. And so where are they from? So these names aren't so clear. So the scholar at the end has written Miron. So it seems that this family of Yehoyariv later on moved to Meron, which is the Meron we know today. And Yedaya, who the Khazaria stone was from Tziporim, they identify as Tzipori. Yes, because the Khazaria stone is maybe 1800 years old, and therefore some of the names of places were different, and some of them are a little bit in doubt. And if you go right to the end here, we will see Ma'aziyahu from Ariach. That's what it said in the Khazaria stone, and they believe it's Chamat Ariach, which could mean Chamei Tiberia. So there's a little bit of doubt exactly where they are, but you have the identification here of those 24 Mishmoros, where they moved to later on. Now, what was the point of this? It's likely that the places they moved to was after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So you might say, well, haven't we dissolved this whole idea of Mishmorot after Churban Bayit Sheni? At that point in time, there is no more avoda on the Beis Hamikdash. There's no need for korbanos. There is no need for Kohanim serving the Beis Hamikdash. A Kohen may still have been careful about ritual purity. We see this in the Gemara. It goes on later, way after Churban Beis Hamikdash, that they were careful on the kelim they used, about whether they're going to be tomei lemeis, and they carried on in many ways preserving the mitzvot of Tumah and Tahara like a Kohen used to, even though they're not going into the Beis Hamikdash. But why do they remain in groups and in communities? So that's an interesting question. Why are they here together, even though there's no need for them to be collected in a group? Why aren't they simply spread out across every town in Eretz Yisrael? So again, I brought down some interesting material. We just read this together. It's very interesting historically. So over here, the source says, it's very interesting to observe this ordering of the Kohanic family into these 24 groups. Nishmeru was preserved. Even after the destruction, and when all the service in the temple had been brought to an end, the families continued to remain together in a fixed place, preserving their identity. The Kohanim jealously maintained their belonging to the various family units they were originally in. And each in their own little town, like Miron and other places, Chamei Tiberia, the Kohanim remained together and did not want to live apart from each other. So Cheshbon HaShavuos Mishmoraseh Nishma Be'ez HaChurban. So even after destruction, all this material was kept well preserved. Why? I just go to this sentence here. Kach Shekasher Yibona Beis Hamikdash, because the Kohanim were waiting for the rebuilding of the temple, and when the temple would be rebuilt, Ya'aleh HaMishmar Shel Osa HaShabbat LiYerushalayim La'avod Avodoso. They wanted to be able to be in a position to spring back to action as Kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash when it would be rebuilt. It's remarkable faith they had, that even though we've seen Churban Abayis, even though they're living in the Galil, even though the Romans have taken over, the whole of Yerushalayim is leveled, there are foxes on the Har Habayis, nevertheless, maybe not in our generation, maybe in the next generation, maybe in the third generation, the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, so we need to preserve our family groupings, and then we'll come in again. We know that Shabbos Parshas Bahar Lo Zachor, it's one part, it's one set. Shalach Lachor is another set. We'll come back to take our rightful slots when the temple is rebuilt, and this carried on for centuries. This is what is so remarkable, and something which is really not so well known. Over here, he brings something from the Cairo Geniza. And it's very interesting. Here we have something dating from the year 932. Yes, so it's 860 years after Churban Habayis. Od nimsa begeniza mismach mishnas dal tovshin sadik dalet, which is 932. Hakolel hachrazah shavuit, which contains the weekly announcement. It's sometimes you have an announcement on the shul announcement list. You're the one that comes out every week that says, Kabbalah Shabbos is at 6:15. So the weekly announcement would have been, it would say for this Shabbos, if there would be a tefillah that said lahachazoras avodas hakohanim al mechona nusma hachrosa. This is the nusach of the hachrosa they found, if you like, on one of these announcement sheets. Hayom Shabbos Kodesh. Today is Holy Shabbos. Shabbos Kodesh LaHashem Hayom. Ezu hi hamishmeres kach v'kach. This week's mishmeres is such and such. Yedayahu, whoever it was. Yes. So 900 years later, they'd remind themselves what the Mishmar group would be if there was a Beis HaMikdash today. Mishmeres kach v'kach. And then if they would go on and say, Harachman HaYashiv es HaMishmeres Limkoma, may the All-Merciful One return the Mishmeres to their rightful place, Mehera b'yameinu amen. Speedily in our days. In the year 932, this was still a weekly hope that the Mishmar of the relevant week would be restored as quickly as possible, and it should not be dismissed from their memories. Furthermore, he goes on to say there's something else, an interesting finding as well. B'chisvei yad kedumim shel HaMishnah b'Mesechet Shabbos min HaGeniza HaKehiris. Again, in the Kari Geniza, we find some very old kisvei yad, handwritten scroll documents. Nimtzu esrim v'arba'as pirkei HaMishnah mucholokin l'shmom u'l'shem mishmar kahuna echad. Mesechet Shabbos just happens to have 24 parokim. Coincidence, there are 24 mishmarot as well. And there is a version of Mishnah's Shabbos, which you can find in the Kari Geniza, which at the beginning of each perek states what the Mishmar for that week should be. What does that mean? B'chol Shabbos haya minhag lilmod es haperek b'Mishnah hashayach l'Mishnah shalos haShabbos. And depending upon which Shabbos it was, they would, which particular Mishmar group, if you like, theoretically should hold that Shabbos for Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, they would say that number Perek. They would learn that Perek on their on that particular Shabbos. Like we learn, if you like, Pirkei Avos. Each week in the Pirkei Avos period, there's another Perek that we learn at Mincha time, or there's a tradition, whether you keep it or not. They had a tradition to learn a particular Perek of Mishnah's Shabbos that corresponded to the number of the Mishmar for that week. So here's an example. Quite incredible. This is from the Kari Geniza. And you can see this is a handwritten Mishnah. I mean, it's a bit difficult to read because it's in the, it's certainly not in modern art scroll font. But if you look at this, it says Yachin Perach Chaf Aleph. This has been highlighted. Yachin, chapter 21. And now this is Perek Chaf Aleph in Mesechet Shabbos. Notel Odom Es Beno. You can just about read it. And if you look at Perek 21 in Shabbos, it starts from Notel Odom Es Beno. A man may take his son. Just before it, it doesn't just say chapter 21. It says Yachin. Well, let's go back. You probably don't remember, but number 21, Yachin. That was the Mishmar of the week. So it doesn't just say chapter 21. It reminds you that this was Yachin's week, and they would learn that Mishnah on Yachin's week, which is the week he would be performing in the Beis HaMikdash. They would learn the Mishnayos 21, and the next week they would learn Mishnayos 22, which is Gomol. Just to prove it to you, we go back over here, and at the bottom that actually says Gomol. Base, Chovis Shenishbara, a barrel that was broken. Matzilin Mipnei Sreifa, whatever it is. So that's chapter 22 in Mishnayos, and you have family Gomol mentioned over here. So preserved again, 1,000 years later, we have the Mishnayos divided up according to the week of the particular Mishmar. It's not something we have any relic of today. I mean, it's not as if any of our Mishnayos carry any of this. We don't have Tehillim brought up broken up in this way, and we don't have any. We don't have any announcements that come out that say this is, week 23 of the 52 weeks. It's a particular mishmar. So we've lost all that. So over here you see the way in which the mishmaros of the Kohanim was preserved for so long. It's interesting in another way as well, because it helps to explain something which is quite curious. When you learn various Masechtas, Kedushin, and various parts of Taurus, and you look at some of the She'elot Tshuvot, you find that the Gemara brings up questions and the Rishonim bring up questions that seem to relate it to unusual circumstances. Very often it's something like, if a shul only has Kohanim, or, if there's no one to bless and they're only blessing themselves, do they bless themselves? Who gets an aliyah? Do they all get aliyahs? Is there how do you choose which Kohen to give an aliyah to? You wonder whether these are events that could possibly have happened. But we see that these are, in fact, events that were happening at the early times of the Talmud, late Mishnaic period, when the Mishmaros was still being kept, and there were at least 24 towns or settlements where the Kohanim were perhaps even the majority and probably the most notable people. So it may well have been that they would be in a situation where only they were being called up, calling themselves up, or where there were no Yisraelim to bless it during Birkat Kohanim. All this is possible. We also see very clearly in the Mishnah, when the Mishnah talks about categories of people who were very, very careful about Tumah and Tahara. And it wasn't just the Kohanim, actually. There were also people called Chaverim. Chaverim here doesn't mean friends. It means very pious individuals who, even though they didn't need to keep the laws of Tumah and Tahara, they didn't need to be so careful. They were nevertheless extremely careful. We'd go to the mikveh. They wouldn't want to be anywhere near sheretz. Where does all this come from? Beis HaMikdash is long gone. But what we do see over here is that there is still this residual attachment to the Beis HaMikdash. There are still Kohanim who consider themselves ready to spring into action. And then there would be other people who would be affected by the particular nature of the Kohanim to try and duplicate them as well, and to be very fastidious also on the laws of Tumah and Tahara. Okay, so that takes us through a little bit of the history of the Mishmoros. Now we maybe will be able to understand what the Mishnah is saying. I mean, I've given you more than is necessary in terms of the historical background, but we will certainly be able to tackle the Mishnah. The Mishnah gives us all sorts of numerology here in terms of who brings what on the first day, on the second day, on the third day, on the fourth day. So let me share a screen. And when I share the screen with you, this Mishnah that seems to be talking way above us suddenly becomes extremely clear. Of course, it requires a little bit of work from my part to make it extremely clear. Okay, so let me try and expand this a little bit for you. So you should be seeing here 3 tables, right? Now, I've got this set up. So you have day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and day 7. Those are the more important, day 1 to day 7. Day 8 is Shmini Atzeres. We'll leave day 8 out for a moment. Let's take table number 1. Table number 1 shows the number of bullocks. These are the porim that were brought each day. And remember, the very first words of the Mishnah said, on the first day they brought 13. Well, here's 13. They brought 13. On day 2, they brought 12. On day 11, you'll find all this in Parshas Pinchas. This is all in the Chumash. This is not Mishnaic, that there was a descending number of korbanos. And by the way, this is what makes the Sukkos Musaf Amida so complicated, because there is a different korban hayom for each day of Sukkot. So therefore, you go down this long list you don't have for Pesach or for Shavuos in the same way. There is a descending number of bullocks according to the day of Sukkot, starting from 13 and going down as low as 7. That's the top line in each table. That's in yellow. Now let's look at the second table. These are the number of rams and the numbers of goats. the numbers of Elim and Kavosim. I've got them on one table, otherwise I'd have needed of goats and Seirim, sorry. And here they're the same every day. There's 2 rams, 2 Elim, and 1 Seir each day, up to the 7th day. That's in addition to the bullocks for the day. And here's the number of Kavosim, the sheep, that was also mentioned in the Mishnah. And there are also an equal number each day, 14 on day 1, 14 on day 2, etc., up to 14 on day 7. Okay, so what's the total number of korbanos offered on day 1? We add 13 to 2 to 1. These are separate. That's 16 so far, plus 14 is 30. And if you add up all of these over all the chagim for all the days, you get 70 korbanos, which is the Shivan Purim. I'm sorry, is that this 25, 36, 46, 50? No, so we're talking here really just about the number of bullocks. Even the bullocks, they come up to 70 if you add them all up. That's the 70 Purim HaChag, which is supposed to correspond to the 70 Umos HaOlam, the 70 nations in the world. But the only thing that descends each day is the number of bullocks. Now, there's a total of 24 mishmoros. Each mishmar, each one of these mishmaric families of these 24 is going to have 1 korban allotted to it. But how is this going to work out? We're going to have a problem, because as the number of korbanos goes down, it would appear we might have some mishmaros with idle hands or whatever. So let's see how it works, therefore. How are we going to, because they'll have nothing to do, because we have too many mishmaros for the korbanos in the latest day of the Chag. So we'll start with day 1. Day 1, we have a total, we'll see this a moment. We have too many for the 24 to start off with. So this is how the Mishnah works out. On day 1, there are 13 bullocks, and those are given to 13 mishmaros, to 13 of those family groupings. The bullock was a very big animal anyway, so there was enough to go around that one mishmar would tend to all the cutting up and the bringing up the ram to the mizbech of each of these bullocks. 1 mishmar for each bullock. Which mishmar? Don't forget the 24. How do you choose which? Question we'll have to attend to in a moment. But there are 13 bullocks, and 13 mishmars are needed to attend to them. You have still 11 mishmaros, nothing to do. So we'll have to give them jobs. Oh, that's not so difficult, because when it comes to the rams and goats, there's 2 and plus 1 is 3, and we'll give 1 of those each to a mishmar. A smaller job, but nevertheless, we'll give 1 mishmar each of these. So we've used up 16. So we've got 8 mishmaros left, but we've got 14 sheep. So how are we going to divide up the 14 sheep between the 8 mishmaros? So we do so on an unequal basis. This is what the 2 lines here show. 6 of the mishmaros carry 2 sheep each. That's 12. 2 mishmaros carry 1 sheep. So that's 6 times 2 is 12, plus 2 is 14. So that's how we do it. 6 of them get the privilege of 2, and 2 of them have to take 1. And this way we're using all 24 mishmaros, although not necessarily everyone gets the same job, not necessarily everyone gets the same number. Over here we see that 6 get 2 sheep. We see that some of them get the bullocks, some of them get the rams, some of them get the goats, etc. Okay, so it's quite a complex arrangement. That's day 1. In day 2, we lose a bullock, which means we only need 12 mishmaros, not like 13 anymore. Well, we need 3 for these again, because there's still 3 animals. So we've used up 15. We have 9 mishmaros left between 15 and 24. But we only have 14 animals. So what are we going to do? So this on the second day, instead of 6 getting 2 each, 5 get 2 each, and 4 get 1 each. 5 times 2 is 10. 4 times 1 is 4. So your 10 and 4 is 14. So what you get to see over here is an interesting thing if you want to look at the trend. When it comes to the mishmaros, each day one less mishmar is needed for the bullocks. The number of mishmaros needed for the rams and goats remains the same, always at 3. But we have this interesting system for the sheep, where you have a descending number carrying 2 sheep, right down to 0 in day 7 for 2 sheep. No one carries 2 sheep, and an increasing number that carries the 1 sheep. So in day 7, 14 of them carry 1 each. Complicated, isn't it? But the Mishnah was even more complicated. So I probably saved you some messy time trying to work out the Mishnah by showing you this table. On the last day, by the way, there are very few korbanos. There's 7 sheep, there's 1 ram and 1 goat, and 1 bullock. So what are we going to do? Well, then, according to here we have a machlokus. There's always a machlokus and everything. But it seems, according to one view, there is a pius, there is a lottery that is carried out between the 24, because you've got a total of 1, 3, 10 korbanos for 24. And so essentially it might be some Kohanic lottery that's carried out there and then in the morning to see who gets which of these mishmaros gets which duty and which perhaps gets no duty at all. That's certainly according to one opinion. The second question, and one I just mentioned before, is how do we choose who gets the bullocks out of these 24, and who gets, for example, to carry 2 sheep, and who gets to carry just 1 sheep, and who gets a ram, etc. How do we choose? Do they fight for it? Supposing, is one of them more of a covered than the other? Well, again, here there are various theories. This Mishnah doesn't address it. According to one opinion, one of the ways in which we use this, the original Gorol, which sets out the ordering, week 1, week 2, week 3, 4, etc., up to 24. Let me just make this smaller again so you see the whole page. One of the ways in which this chart is used is that this determines the orders in which people get the privilege to carry bullocks. According to one view, therefore, you need 13 bullocks on day 1. Yes, so numbers 1 to 13 will all get a bullock, and then the goats and the sheep, etc., are going to be apportioned somehow between 14 and 24, which gives the privilege of the bullocks, if you say they are a privilege, to the ones according to their ranking on this Gorol. So this Gorol listing here and its sequence would be used to determine how the korbanos work was allocated between the 24 mishmaros. And strangely enough, according to this view, and then you have, instead of going with 2 to 14 the next day, you would have, 2 to 13 or 2 to 14. It goes 13 to 24. There's a very strange arrangement which is given by some of the commentaries. The point is to try and give everyone a chance to get different animals. So, but there is still a pecking order over here in which the privileges were allocated. So let me just go back again. Stop sharing for a moment. I've got now to stop sharing. Second. Okay. If you want to, you can go back to the Mishnayos. Oh, maybe what I will do is I'll share at the same time as I'll do the Mishnah, just so you can see I didn't make up the Mishnah while I was showing you my chart. And you'll see this in the words of the Mishnah. Okay, let me just make this a bit bigger. Okay. So the Mishnah started by Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag, on the first day of Sukkot, Hayusham Shlosha Osa Porim. There were 13 bullocks, as you can see, 13 bullocks. Eilim Shnaim V'Sar Echad, 2 rams and 1 goat. That's the second table. Nishtar Yusham Arba Osa Kvosim, leaving again 14 sheep. And the Mishnah said, Lishmona Mishmaros, for the 8 mishmaros that are left over, 6 and 2. How are they apportioned? So by Yom HaRishon, Shisha Makrivim Shnaim Shnaim, on the first day, excuse me a second, on the first day, 6 of these Mishmaris carry 2 each. I'm reading the Mishnah. V'hasha'ah, and the remaining 2, echad echad. By Yom Sheni, B'Sheni, on the second day, Chamisha Makrivim Shnaim Shnaim, he's only looking at table number 3 here. 5 carry 2 each. V'hasha'ah, 4 carry one each. B'Shlishi, on the third day, 4 carry 2 each. And 6, the remaining 10, carry 1 each. It's always understood that we're losing 1 mishmar each day from his work rota for carrying the bullocks, because the bullocks are descending in number, which is why we're always getting an extra mishmar of spare hands, if you like, which we need to somehow allocate. So let's just go further. Boravi, on the 4th day, just that we should do the Mishnah. Shlosha makrivim shnaim shnaim. 3 carry, where are we here? 3 carry 2, and the rest, which happens to be 8, carry 1. B'chamishi, shnaim makrivim shnaim shnaim. On the 5th day, 2 carry 2 each, and 10 carry 1. On the 6th day, echad makriv shnaim, only 1, as you see over here, carries 2. V'hashar echad echad, and the rest, which happens to be 12, because you have 13 spare after the 8 and the 11 here. Those 12 will carry 1 each. Okay. Kulon, the Mishnah goes on, having said that, the Mishnah goes on to say, it's gone through from day 1 to 7, essentially setting out the table I've shown you. Kulon, all the Mishmaros, all those family groupings, Shovin, they're all, at this point in the 7th day, I think he means to say, all these 14 are carrying 1 each. There's no more, some are carrying 2, and some are carrying 1. They're all carrying 1. Shovin. Bashmini, now on the 8th day, now we come to Shmini Atzeres, where there's very little work to do. On the 8th day, Chozru Lefayes, the Mishnah says actually over here, actually there must be another version somewhere else. The Mishnah says they come to a pious. They come to a lottery. There used to be a lottery even every day in the Beis HaMikdash for certain functions. So here we have a lottery, and there was a lottery on Yom Kippur for certain things, and there's a lottery here because there's a total of 10 karbonos. There are 24 mishmaros, as I say. So how do you split 10 jobs into 24 jobbers? You obviously, some of them are going to get a job, and some you can't give people to share. You could give some people 1 each and some 2 each, but you can't have 2 kohanim on one particular on a lamb or something like that. That doesn't going to work out at all. Okay, so that's what we said, and that's kevoregalim, the pious. We still use the word pious today in terms of the lottery in Eretz Yisrael. That lottery is something they used to do during the regalim as well. And because there were very few korbanos on Shmini Atzeres, it would be the system used as well on the 8th day. Omru, the Mishnah finishes off by making a statement, really. Mi shehikriv porim hayom lo yakriv l'machar. There was a rule. Whoever offered a bullock today doesn't offer it tomorrow. Ela chozrim chalila, but it does go round again, and they often get a second bite of the bullocks, so to speak. What does that mean? That sounded very rude. I do apologize if it sounded very rude. What he really means to say is, over here, we have 13 mishmars on day 1, for example, and let's say they're groups number 1 and 13, as I showed you. The next day, we try to avoid any of those 13 to be amongst these 12. So instead of making it, numbers 2 to 14, we'll make it numbers 14 to 24 or something like that, right? So that the same people who did yesterday shouldn't be carrying a bullock again today. We like to split the jobs off job differentiation a little bit over here. So on some of these people who got the bullocks on day one will get maybe the rams or the sheep on day two. But eventually, some of them are going to get bullocks to carry again, according to the way in which the rota works. You can't exclude everyone. That's what the Mishnah says. And that takes us to the end of the Mishnah, which is all really I'm going to do today. A Mishnah, which seems to be all about numbers and about the Korbanos, did give us some very interesting insights, I think, to the history of the Kohanim and how long the system of the Mishmars carried on, at least being preserved as the heritage of those family groups. If you look at the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, it does talk about a few of these Kohanic families coming back. They're named, but maybe only, I'm not sure whether 3 or 4 actually came back. So when it comes to actually by Sheni, they didn't even have all these 24 families in place. But nevertheless, it seems that the culture and the heritage was somehow retained, even into later times. And maybe their families eventually got back from Bothel. I don't know whether they did or they didn't into later Bai Sheni, well after Ezra and Nehemiah. It's not clear exactly how they carried out the service during Bai Sheni, because the 24 groups are really preserved best during Bai Rishon. And then afterwards, it seems to be in some sort of tradition. Whether that tradition was well preserved, one doesn't know. But if there were still people who felt that they were from certain families in the 9th century, then that itself is very telling, and shows the extent to which Jews try to preserve their tradition as long as possible. Okay, we'll call it today now. Please God, we'll miss next week, which is Chol HaMoed. And we'll be back again in business the first week after Sukkot. So thank you for joining me. I'm just going to stop.